thank you, Orion. That was very rich, a lot of content to speak or feed into the questions and comments. So, open question.
Thank you, Orion. So, one surprising thing missing from the talk, which might be a good honest, is how this all fits in with Kodo imperial Buddhism. So the idea of, you briefly mentioned Inori, but in the Kyokuchokugo, there's a whole idea. I think it says, I can't quote it verbatim, but when the occasion arises, you will give yourself the nation. This idea of sacrificing the self, the annihilation of the self for some greater good is there. And the emphasis on the giving of the self for something socially moral. That Mahayana Buddhism is superior to Hinayana because it has a social element. I guess here, I'll put it into a question like this. How does all this that you mentioned here fit in with the social context of the state giving primacy to Shinto, Buddhism feeling like it's under attack, Buddhism feeling like it has to show itself as relevant to the new state?
So that's a very good question. Thank you. The idea of Kodo Bukkyo itself doesn't appear until a little bit later. So there are different ways that Buddhism relates with the state. And I think that this is the first early stage that you can say continues until exactly around this time, the mid 80s. The relationship with Shinto is quite interesting because, as you know, we have this in Meiji 5, you have the establishment of the Kyodo Shoku system, right? So Buddhists, Confucianists, and everyone else has to work together. There's the Daikyoin, and then you have, like this nationwide system of spreading the Sanjo no Kyosoku. And that Daikyoin system itself, it doesn't last for too long, but the Kyodo Shoku system itself continues well into the 1880s, until 1884. So up until 1884, like they're still pretty much connected with, there's no actual, it starts to appear like, Inoue Kawashi is one of the people who actually problematize this, and that will, of course, lead to the way that the Constitution was drafted and to how the Constitution deals with religion. Jolly knows that way much better than I do, but with these questions, right? So this is the first stage we have to. I think there are like the next stage of the relationship between Buddhism and the nation is around the 1900s, when you have the Bill of Religions that ultimately is not doesn't pass the Kizokuin, right? The House of Peers. So you have the second stage. Then you have something after the Russo-Japanese War, especially after 1908 with the Gochin Shosho, it shifts yet again. And when the emperor dies, so there are all these like different stages. And the word Kodo Bukkyo itself, for instance, it doesn't become a common term until the early Showa period, which is yet another way. So it's a very post-war Japanese historiography thing that we tend to understand this in terms of Tennosei Kokan, lump everything together and say, okay, Buddhism and nationalism is very Brian Victoria-ish in a way, but it's not. The nation was demanding different things, and also like there's no one nation, there are nations, right? Like inside the government, there are different approaches to things. Like, and these people were trying to please specific people inside the government. They had their connections, like for instance, like the Yamaguchi folk, like Shimaji Mokurai, and so on. So it's a very interesting question. At this first stage in the 1880s, especially throughout the 1880s, this issue of morality seems to be the most pressing. And if you read, for example, the recent work by Kameyama Mitsuhiro, like he's actually trying to explain how this thing that was regarded by a number of Buddhists in the Meiji period, like the idea of precepts, right? This was revived, like in a way, people rediscovered the precepts as a form of national morality, right? And it's all about this debate in the 1880s. And then in the 1890s, it will become a more legal debate because that's after the Constitution and especially after 1894, which is when you have the definition of the Naichizaku, when they signed the treaty with England, and they understand that by 1888, there will be no there will be Naichizaku, right? This beginning of the Naichizaku. So foreigners, crazy, scary foreigners will be able to live wherever they like. And that actually changes things a bit. And they start to think and to discuss a law of religions. And this debate shifts, from my perspective, from this morality focused perspective to a more legal perspective, which also includes, of course, morality. But did I answer your question? I often don't.
Yes,
but-
yes. I guess what threw my question off was the use of the word prudent, which, as you said, it's a term that's used later. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting here is, it seems to me, this much better than I do, but the idea is like, Edo period Buddhism is seen as kind of not socially useful, and here we're gonna create a practical Buddhism. We're gonna make a Buddhism that's useful in some way.
Yeah.
And social morals seems to be revival of the precepts in Zen and other places. This is a way to make Buddhism practical. Does that sound?
Yeah, no, it is. It is like, and I think this way of making Buddhism practical is what shifts, like, into the Daisho and Showa. Here is like, how do we make this practical? How do you make this useful? And that changes a little bit, like throughout time. But the connection with the nation is always there.
William, thank you so much. I think my question follows up on Clark's, but sort of pushes you a little bit farther forward historically, because I really want the long story that you told us you were trying to do, and it's really about this notion of social morals. And so I've read some of the texts from the 1880s and 1890s as Buddhists are reacting to Christian influence or perceived Christian influence. They're like, oh, well, the Christians do morality really well. We need to do morality well too, right? But there's very little content of what constitutes morality. It's just like, oh, they do that sort of thing. Occasionally they'll talk about charity, or they'll talk about like things like that we might categorize now as social work. If we push a little bit farther into the Meiji era, then people like James Mark Fields have talked about the Buddhist discovery of society, that like this is the place where we need to engage in. But as I was listening to you talk about the discourse about social morals, I was like, there is no content there.
There is no content.
What's fascinating about that is that the content does become quite striking and apparent as we enter the Taisho era, right? You have the Kyoto Doshi, like, among others, talking about things like the woman problem, prostitution, these sorts of things. And then by the time we get into the 1930s, you have things like popular radio programs that are designed in part to exhort popular audiences and make them better behaved, right? So what's the through line? How do we get from zero content in terms of social morals to actually having content? I want to hear how that's related specifically to Buddhist studies. And the question that sort of popped into my mind at the beginning of your talk, thinking about this, is like, is there a way in which issues like, initiatives like the construction of the Taisho canon are actually a moral project, not an intellectual or academic project? Are they linked in people's minds? That'll end there. I'm gonna just like keep talking about it.
No, it's a very good question. Thank you. So at this first stage, you're right. So in the 1880s, again, people are, I think morality and dotoku is a keyword not only for Buddhists, right, but for the intellectual world in general. So at this first stage, you do have people like who are trying to come up with more practical things, like Shaku Unsho and his Juzenkai, right? This is precept revival. And also you can read, and this is the way I read it, like the Shushogi, for instance, which is like from 1888, right? It has a section on precepts and like on how, and it's very clear to me that this is a practical application of this for Shinshu people. And this is the thing, Yoshitani is Shinshu, Murakami is Shinshu. They don't really go into the content of morality. Murakami will much later, like after the Russo-Japanese War, like when he starts talking about Shuyo, but that's a different context. At this first stage, I think that the most pressing issue for someone like Yoshitani, there were two issues actually. The first thing that he encountered, like when he was invited to lecture at Todai, Tanzan was just doing whatever he liked. And if you read, like all these memoirs by, former students, Tanzan came to class drunk and, he just, talked about women, and he just told us that if we did Buddhism correctly, we could become immortals, like it made no sense whatsoever. Whereas like, Yoshitani was much more, he was the Gakuso par excellence, right? He taught at the Takakura Gakuryo, Like, so his classes were really well organized. So like they were two very opposite, like individuals. So in the case of Yoshitani, like he came in and he uses the Hashu Koyo for a few years, right? And then he starts realizing that in order to teach to these people who have no background in Buddhism whatsoever, he has to come up with new materials. So that's why he writes the Bukkyo Taishi and the Bukkyo Soron, right? Like to educate these people. So for this first generation, for like, Yoshitani and Tanzan to an extent, because what he does, he's using first this Confucian text, the Hokyohen, and then he changes to the Daijo Kishingon. And he uses Daijo Kishingon for a few years because that's something that appeals to young people at the time, and also is in connection with his ideas, perspective of Buddhism as his mind-centered kokoro jushin. So what he does, for instance, that I didn't go into detail, is in his Bukkyo Taishi, for instance, he provides this really detailed analysis of the many different types of nirvana that, Max Mueller's understanding is narrow and whatnot. There's not one type of nirvana. There are like several types of nirvana and people are completely misapprehending it. So he seems to be more worried in this more immediate issue of countering Takahashi's very, very influential perspective, not only Takahashi. So I think he doesn't get to the content, but people at the same time who are also connected, like for example, which say are connected to this mainstream, are also more preoccupied with the issue of content.
Anthropologist question here, if I may. I'm interested also in practice, but I'm not so much social practice, ritual practice. I mean, what is Mahayana Buddhism about? People worshiping a variety of divine beings that help them get through life, right? It's about kanmon, it's about amida, it's about devotion. That's our devotion through ritual. That's one thing. What's the other thing, especially in Japan, is about making sure that people who die, that they're taken care of. Like it's providing ritual care so they don't become mental care and they don't start causing trouble. So the ritual reality of lived Buddhism is completely and utterly absent of what these people are talking about. It's like they're talking about two completely different things. And I get that. That was the discourse about Buddhism at the time, that it was detached from the lived reality of many people. But so the question is, and I'm just really curious, at what point do academics in Japan start realizing that, wait, there's something like a lived reality out there? And I know that Mizoku is emerging as a discipline in the early 20th century. Now, the Minzoku Gakusha initially were not maybe more interested in local Matsuri or Shinto kind of things rather than Buddhism. But maybe, so the question is, at what point do scholars start looking into lived Buddhist practice, folk Buddhism, if you want to call it that way, the more anthropological study of Buddhism as a social reality? When does that emerge? And does it emerge in the same departments of this? Or does it really take place?
Absolutely not. Not in this department. Not today. They still couldn't give a damn about Buddhism. But that's the thing, that's what I find interesting with Japanese academia. Instead of, so it's still not part of Buddhist studies in Japan. It's still not there. But instead of trying to change the field as it is, they come up with new fields. They create completely different, disciplines to address these issues, which they do find it important. But Hayashi Sensei, he was, I think, a guest editor of this, 生きた仏教とか、宗教研究の、もう20年ぐらい前ですかね。その特集号があったんですよね。先生が。まさに今のYTさん。So this, he edited an issue exactly precisely about your question, whether this, the study of Buddhism was essentially, theories and, doctrine and so on, but, this whole practical aspects from it. I think 2002 or 3. You can say, I think you can find it online.
So you're saying it's actually very recent?
Yes.
And then okay. Did they look into this at all, or was that just like the subject?
I actually said, do you want to answer this one? Really, literally, guest edited a whole issue about this. Okay, so at this point, they don't, the idea of, there's recent research about this by IM PhD from Komazawa University, Takei-san. Keiko. Like he just wrote a dissertation. I think he's turning that into a book on the reception of the idea of Gire as part of his research, like how Gire is becomes important. Also, we just had our recent PhD, like Wu Peiyao. She wrote her dissertation on the formation of the concept of Shinko, of faith, right, and how that is connected to practice. So I think that we're now starting to get a better grasp on how these things develop, but you do not actually have people seriously considering Gire and these more practical issues until I guess maybe a couple of decades later. Like Anesaki Masaharu is actually one of the first people to do that, like to write about the theory of Gire. But again, like it's very detached from what is going on in the field. You know, he's actually transplanting what was being discussed in Europe around the time on like ritual to Japan. And it doesn't connect, like, for example, he doesn't go do field work based on that and describing, you know, the realities of Mahayana Buddhism, of temple Buddhism, whatnot. That doesn't happen at this early stage. So I do think it's the field of Mizoku Gaku itself is independent, institutionalized field. It's from the post-war days, right? So you don't have that field as an independent field in the pre-war days.
Thanks, Orion, for really informative paper. I think my question also has more to do with the through line, goes beyond the department at Todai. But I'm wondering, in the controversy over the authenticity of the status of the Mahayana, and you talked very clearly and illuminatingly about the critique of annihilation, reductive annihilationist interpretations of the so-called Hinayana Nirvana. I'm wondering, behind that, was there perhaps a similar reductionist idea that the Mahayana could be seen, it could be interpreted as legitimating lay life and social involvement, and behind that, getting back to Clark's question, involvement in the nation as a good citizen. And I'm wondering about trends that are going along with this whole discourse. It struck me that although the two individuals that you talked about are priests, and we really start to see from this period the beginning of not the beginning, starts in the Edo period, but you see more and more experts on Buddhism who are not priests. You know, because the academics become another category, and they could be lay people. I'm wondering if there's any connection there, and if there's also any connection with the Nikujiki Saitai stuff, where priests are encouraged to adopt a more traditionally lay style of life.
Very good
involved
question.
with the nation.
Thank you. First, this is an interesting anecdote. The first person to teach Buddhist studies at Todai that was not a priest was Nakamura Hajime. And he remains as one of the few. Most people, so to this day, are priests. And in the pre-war days, with the exception of two people, three actually, all of them are Jodo Shinshu priests. So the issue of like Nikujiki Saitai, you don't really see, you do get, for example, like Shinshu people writing about it, but more in the Edo period than the modern period. Because it's not something that, speaks to them specifically. You guys, as you see in Japanese book, like, you have like people from Ichien, from Soto, who are very much worried, and Fuda Yokai and Shakunsho, like, and all these people are very much worried about what's going to happen to Buddhism from now on. If we let this, it's the state trying to destroy us, like, so there are all these conspiracy theories, but not so much conspiracy theories behind it, but they don't really focus on it. They don't really write that much about it. And the Nikujiki Saitai, by the point that the department is established, it's only 7 years later, but around the time of this debate, I think it's already more or less of a non-issue. They have overcome it. Like by the mid 80s, I don't think it becomes an issue again when they have, when the Kyodo Shoku system is abolished, the state requires there's a change in how religion is administered by inside the Naimusho, and each Buddhist school is required to come up with their teachings. This is what leads to the writing of the Shushogi, among others. And around that time, they have to worry about this because they have to crystallize whether or not people can get married. And It's something that I think Naka-san told me, the first generation of Nichiren priests, they don't get married. It's the second generation. There's the people who are born after this, like, that start actually getting married, doing the family temple thing.
Conducive to a lay, especially boss.
Yes, this is how they justify the Mahayana, right? This is why what I've been trying to say recently is that, for example, like you have in 1901, Murakami Sensho publishes his Bukkyo Toitsuron, which had been working on for like almost a decade by that point. And in that particular work, like he claims that, not claim, yeah, the Mahayana is not, was not directly preached by the Buddha. And he does essentially the same thing. He says that the Mahayana is not Butsetsu, but it's Butsui. So it's a historical development of the intention of the Buddha, which is really not different from what Yoshitani was saying at this point. But one of the reasons why Murakami was forced to leave Otanihai at the time was because Yoshitani was not happy with the work. So Yoshitani was like a big, figure like inside Otanihai at the time. He essentially forced Murakami to leave. And the question, I had this conversation with Ryan Ward. In the book, Murakami emphasizes that the meaning of Buddhism and the essence of Buddhism, of course, is a different take. It's not the Jiga-Zen Mitsu take on the Nirvana, but it's Niham. So I do think that that this agreement is connected to that. But their understanding of Mahayana as a social religion, as a more appropriate kind of Buddhism, and it's something that didn't really explore much here. But there's also, like in the mid-'80s, this whole the whole impact of evolutionary theory, right, of Spencerism. So Mahayana developed later, so Mahayana is a later development, and therefore it's better, it's a more appropriate, it adapted. So the fact that Buddhism does not exist, and it's something that they will say, something that, Enyo will say, Ikuta Tokuno, Oda Tokuno will say, is that because Buddhism doesn't exist in India anymore, and it only exists in China in a more or less philosophical form, Japanese Buddhism is the best form of Buddhism. At this point, the interesting thing is that they are debating Christians, right? So at this first stage, up until the mid-'90s, 1890s, and I would say like the early 20th century, they are still debating Christians. So they are still talking to Christians. So they have this need not to emphasize this Japanese aspect of Buddhism, even though it's already here. They don't overemphasize it because they're contrasting Buddhism and Christianity, right? There's these two religions. So they feel more or less this need of depicting Buddhism as more or less unified whole. But after, for example, the Russo-Japanese War, this will completely shift. So what you have is like this throng of like works emphasizing, the peculiarities of Japanese Buddhism against Chinese Buddhism and Indian Buddhism and whatnot. But at this point, they do have this perspective that Japanese Buddhism is somewhat better. And the reason for that is also can be explained via their, through their, the way that they were influenced by it. So the Mahayana was very good in many ways, and that was, so what I mean is that the justifications for the Mahayana were not purely doctrinal, right? They passed with these.
大変素晴らしい発表です。私の、質問は、最後の、仏教がどのように、文明化された国家を実施するために、貢献したかということです。で、私の、コメントは、オリオさんの、問題の立て方っていうのは、知識人の言説のレベルを言ってるんだと。で、私はそれを、いくら言っても、仏教が国家にとってどういうふうに機能したかには到達しないというふうに言います。で、そこに挙げている知識人たちの言葉は、その日本の国家がですね、仏教に何を期待していたかとはまた違う話だと思うんです。で、日本の国家が仏教に期待していたのは、共同職が明治5年から17年になったように、三条の教則という、天皇を中心とするモラルをですね、国民には、それを僧侶が言え、いうことぐらいしか期待してないということになると思います。で、 共同職も、教育と、関連しながらば、だんだん教育の方が、共同職よりも、教科よりも協力しになると、そんなに、効果もなくなってくる。でも、教育の支えているかもしれない。あと、日清戦争以降は、戦争が行われるたびに、重軍層として、行くことになるとなった時に、シビライズネーションという日本の文明化っていうのは、教育とか軍隊によってなされてるんですけども、それをこう横から支えるっていうか、支えるのが仏教の役割としてあって、仏教それ自体が日本をシビライズさせてないと私は思う。言説のレベルでいくらか出てくる知識人のレベルでは、仏教は科学的だとか、仏教は、で、最も重要なのはやっぱり共同職の時作った時の政府の意図で、キリスト教防御ですよね。もう、キリスト教を防御するために、仏教に教えさせる。でも、キリスト教が実際、明治憲法以降、実際もう明治の最初から入ってますけども、ある種公認化されてくると、キリスト教防御っていうのはもう、仏教にとって、政府にとって何の意味もない。で、その時にやっぱり重軍層とか、もっと後になってくると、社会事業とか、そういうことになって社会に貢献していくんですけども、私からすると、最後のオリオンさんの問いは、いかにして仏教が、日本を天皇制国家にするのに寄与したかという問いに、私はなるべきだと。
ありがとうございます。先生が今おっしゃったことはもちろんもっともで、ただここで分けなきゃいけないのが、先生が今おっしゃったように、国家が求めているのは、例えば、共同職、それは一つの形なんです。で、共同職は先生今おっしゃったように、1884年までなんです。明治17年。その前からもうそんなにちゃんと機能してなかったということはよく、言われること。その、機能しなくなった時期に、つまり国家が明らかに仏教者に対して求めていることと、仏教者が国家に対して貢献したいことというのは多分両方あるんですよ。で、それは時々マッチしないんですね。そのマッチしないっていうのが一つの。ただ、この段階では、こういう形でですね、東大の中で仏教をこういう形で制度化して成果にしていくっていうところが、国家が仏教に対して求めている一つの、ものだと思うんですよね。この人たちが、なんで原寛さんがやっぱりその創世記を離れていた時期に呼ばれたのかとか、そして吉谷閣順の場合は、こういう新宗の人で、新宗の中ではビッグネームですけれども、伝来を教えるために、しかも来るときにいざとなると、教えるのはこういう、昔からのこういう仏教概論的に使われてたようなものを来るわけですね。なので、これは原川さんの場合はまた別なんですけれども、吉谷の場合とか村上の場合は明らかに、そういう、なんていうか、当時の国家レベルでの議論ですね、そのナショナルモラリティとか、その国民道徳という問題に、回答しようとした一つの。で、彼らが東大に席を置いていたということが、そういうパブリックな役割を果たして、そういう声がまた違う響き方するわけなんですよね。高倉学寮の誰々偉い人と、その東京帝国大学、この段階では、帝国大学ですね。帝国大学の、教員として、仏教について、仏教と国民道徳とかって、そういう発言しているということが、また千葉線の問題です。大きいと思うんですよ。なので、今回先生がおっしゃるように、確かにちょっと物足りなさっていうか、ものの見方が、部分的というか、一方的なのかもしれないんですけれども、それは、ちょっと分かっているつもりです。つまり、あくまでも、こういう、特に、吉谷、原田さんってやっぱりそのメインストリームはあまりならないっていうところがあるんだけれども、この、当時のニーズに応えようとしたと思うんです。この科学的な武器を作るとか。そこは多分変わらないんですが、この村上につながっていく、その吉谷のラインは、明らかに私は何かには答えようとしてない。なので、これは、国家が仏教に求めたことの一つではある。
私はオリオンさんの知らないんですけども、この世の哲学とかいう言い方が出てきますよね。
はい。
で、そういう仏教とか儒教だったものを、宗教ではなく哲学っていう形で、東京 哲学で教えるっていうふうな形を取ると、これはちょっと吉谷とか原が何を言ってるかっていうのを、西洋哲学に対して東洋のそういう宗教を哲学として言い直して、それを教育の中に入れていくっていうのが、今回にとってはすごく大事で、吉谷が原が何を言おうと、どうでもよかったんじゃないかと。
まあそうかもしれない。そう言われてみたら、そうかもしれないんですけれども、まあ彼らがこういうことを言ってたっていうことは、まあ、後に影響を及ぼしてるわけですし、先生はおっしゃる通りだと思う。なんかまあ、ただ、その国家が求めたのは哲学だっていうので、その先ほどのその改正で、なんかこの西洋哲学に対して東洋哲学っていうで、その中でシナ哲学とインド哲学っていう、インド哲学のはこの二人だっていうところで、まあ基本的には仏教の、先生もそれは論文書かれていると思うんですけども、それはなんかこの仏教という特定宗教の名前の入っている科目って東大の中に置くのはまずいということで、まあそういうふうにしたということなんですが、それがなんか当時の日本の仏教のこういう人たちの営みを変えていくんですよね。だからなんで丹山がなんかあんなに仏教は宗教じゃなくて哲学って言わなきゃいけなかったのかとか、そしてその後、今日はあんまり引いてないんですけれども、まあ、論文ではちょっと引くつもりで、吉谷閣授が、どうして仏教が宗教、哲学でありながら宗教でもあるとか、その後の決まり文句になるんですよね。仏教は両方だっていうことをみんなずっと言っていくっていうことが、この時代からの、この時代のニーズに応えるために出てきた問題なんじゃないかっていうことは思うんですね。それはもう少しコンテクスト化しようかなと思って、今回の論文書いたんですけども、失敗かな。
My interest is in framing this in terms of Pan-Asianism, which goes into a lot of different phases. But the idea that there's a kind of Buddhist Pan-Asianism going on. So just a little before and after the period you're talking about, did the Kamakura debates in 1875 certainly had an effect in a tertiary way with Olcott's visit? Did it have any primary effect in Japan? And then subsequently that Anigakara Dhammapalla's Bodhgaya rehabilitation effort, were there any Japanese involved in that?
Yes.
Or just more broadly, how was this, again, it's kind of different from Brian Victoria's Buddhist nationalism thing. Was there a kind of a Buddhist Pan-Asianism going around at this time?
Around this time is difficult to say, but also, of course, it depends on what you call Buddhist Pan-Asianism. But there is a renewed interest in India, right? Because this reception of the idea of Buddhism as a religion requires, that you have a founder, a clear founder, a set of texts, like the whole deal. So people get this renewed interest in the figure of Shakyamuni, the founder of Buddhism, and in connection to that, to the place that he supposedly lived, which is India, right? So there are two recent works that I would highly recommend. One is by Micah Auerbach, which is precisely about the development of Mike also focuses on Takashi Goro a little bit, on the formation of on the development of the image titled the story of sage, Shakyamuni in the modern period. And the other one by Richard Jaffe, this is the second book, Seeking Shakyamuni. So it's precisely about this. I'm not sure if we can call that, at least at this early stage, Pan-Asianism, but maybe a proto kind of.
So the Japanese were involved with the Bodhgaya revitalization.
Yes, partly. Some of them at least.
Yeah.